Hey guys, and welcome to another video. I'm Shubrotim and I'm your yoga teacher for today. In this video, I'm going to talk to you guys about sacred geometry, what's a mandala, what's yantra, and what is really behind, what is the essence of the whole chakra system. To begin with, let me just introduce you guys to what is sacred geometry and what is mandala. Sacred geometry is a series of geometrical patterns that represents the human being in the form of geometric figures. The reason why this is done is because it is believed in esoteric science and art is that everything can be represented in a mathematical way in the form of geometric figures. They believe that the brain has the potential to tap in to its own realm in a more precise and a more penetrative manner by means of going in through a series of geometrical patterns and hitting a point of consciousness that blasts you open into the infinite. Now, let me also tell you something about how sacred geometry and how mantras, yantras, and all of these things actually came into being and why. So back in the day, when everybody was ruled by kings, common people were denied this sacred and esoteric knowledge. And the reason for this is because the kings and the ministers did not want people to get this power, because they knew if they had this power, they would discover their own hidden potential and probably there would be some kind of revolt. Probably they would not serve the kings anymore, which eventually is what happened when science and technology started developing. But back in those days, when people who had this knowledge, if they ever were found to possess it, were persecuted, what would happen is that they would make secret societies in order to protect themselves from being discovered. And in these secret societies, they invented devices that would allow them to penetrate into the depths of their consciousness. And the way they did this was by creating a series of geometric patterns that ended in a point. That point represented the point of stillness when you meditate intensely. That point represented the end of all search for consciousness. That point is called Bindu. It's called the Bindu chakra in Sri Vidya. Sri means sacred and Vidya means science. Now, back in those days, when people were being persecuted for possessing such knowledge, it was important for people who had this knowledge to somehow practice it in a safe manner. So they also formed what is called Twilight Language, which is language coded in the form of esoteric poems. And the sacred figures and the sacred geometry that is behind the square, the triangle, the rectangle are actually coded figures that represent certain stages in consciousness. And this is what I think. And when a person is initiated into the science of this art, they are taught what each of these things means by means of mantras or sounds that has a certain vibration. Okay. Let me start off with sacred geometry and mandala. There is essentially very little difference between sacred geometry, mandala, yantra, and chakra. They're essentially one and the same. There are minor differences. For example, in sacred geometry, and if you look at the yantra, they're identical. It's just that sacred geometry seems to have more of a new age spirituality sort of thing going on over there, and yantra is more ancient. In yantra, what happens is that the deity is kept in the middle of that geometric pattern, okay? Eventually, when the practitioner focuses on a yantra, what happens is that they are made to go in towards their own consciousness, penetrate into the depths of their own consciousness, represented by minor gods and goddesses, until they reach the main god, which is self-identifiable, okay, as the highest consciousness. Let me just start off with mandala. In mandala, what happens is that mandala roughly translates to sacred space, okay? When you sit for meditation and when you sit in this thing called a mandala, which is basically a painted geometric pattern which is very large, you call in the deities by means of opening certain gates that's painted along the borders of this mandala. And after you get the deities to come in and penetrate into your consciousness, you become one with them and you're able to access whatever knowledge it is that they hold. I told you everything was esoteric, everything had to be represented not in a literal way. So even the gods and goddesses represented dimensions of human consciousness that actually exist. But it was important to put it in this manner, to give it an artistic turn, so that it does not overwhelm either the administration, the kings, and the ministers, and neither does it overwhelm the common man, because this knowledge gives you access into such high dimensions that could easily overwhelm a person based off of what he or she discovers within that search, within that journey. The gates are there. If you look at the mandala, if you look at the yantra, if you look at sacred geometry, you will notice more commonly in yantra, mandala and chakra that there is always a border, there is always a gate. Like in esoteric paganism, you always find that there is a protective circle that is drawn around a person or a line on the threshold of a door in order to prevent negative entities to come in. That's pretty much what's done while, in the sense of the yantra and the mandala. It's to prevent the practitioner from getting affected by any negative entity either generated from outside the environment or from his own consciousness. He's protected from these negative entities from his own consciousness by means of constantly trying to identify with the gods and goddesses embodied and somehow absorbed in this whole, within what the geometric patterns represent. It's a very complex art. It's not as easily explainable, but when you actually study the yantra and the mandala, you notice that it starts with a square, and then it moves on to a semicircle, a circle, and then into a rectangle. Each one of these geometric figures represents a certain power of consciousness. In a mandala, there is more emphasis on gods and goddesses. In a yantra, there is more emphasis on that one god and the mantra associated with that god. In the chakra system, it's a series. Instead of a series of overlapping geometric patterns, it's a series of a linear-based geometric pattern that's separated, that does not overlap one on top of another. So this is why I told you they're all essentially one and the same. The practitioner who uses these devices eventually has to get to the highest point, which is the bindu, that void consciousness represented as a dot, a point. And this is also a yogic practice, which is commonly known as trataka, where the practitioner is told to sit and focus on a point, or on the tip of a candle flame, or on a deity, or a god or a goddess. Essentially, it is to tap into the deepest parts of your brain and get it into this one-pointed focus where you eventually merge with that void. A mandala is more of an art. A yantra is more of a mathematically constructed geometric patterns that helps or brings in the presence of that deity which is associated with these geometric patterns and the mantras. The chakra system, on the other hand, is more fixed. There is very little, for example, in a yantra, you have a yantra that is dedicated to Shiv, that is dedicated to Durga, that is dedicated to Lakshmi. In a mandala, which is more of a Buddhist form of yantra, you find it's dedicated to various Buddhist gods and goddesses. But in the chakra system, I feel the chakra system is more of a universal phenomenon. The gods and goddesses remain fixed, and this is why the chakra system is more popular than the former two. Sacred geometry is more of a New Age phenomenon, and I think people from the West who studied Eastern literature and Eastern spirituality and esotericism, they went and created their own form of sacred geometry, which is literally the sacred geometry that you see nowadays. And the whole point of all these systems is to bring consciousness into one point of focus, a point of space of stillness. It's the same thing that happens to you when you practice an asana perfectly. It's the same thing that happens to you when you perform the breathing practices in the correct way. It's the same thing when you meditate. All of these practices helps you get to that point of stillness, that point of one-pointedness, that absolute focus of mind, okay? And all of these systems seem to be different, but essentially they're one and the same. Not everybody was able to practice Hatha Yoga back in those days because not everybody possessed the physical ability. So they decided to choose mantras, chanting the name of a god or a goddess. And by chanting the name over and over again, made several scattered waves of the mind into one singular wave, okay? Focused completely on the sound of the mantra, and eventually that mind merged with the mantra and became one. It's essentially the same thing, okay? In the Yantra, people just focused on the geometric pattern until they penetrated into the point, the bindu, and reached superconsciousness. And all of this is esoteric because it needs special knowledge in order to understand what the mantra means, what the deity represents, and how this is to be practiced. So this is just a short introduction to the various methods of stilling your mind, and I just wanted to talk about it because I found it interesting, and I found it of interest because I could correlate the practice with what happens to a person when they're practicing Kundalini Yoga, for example. It's the same thing. You move from the periphery, like in a Yantra or a Mandala, you find that there are borders, there are gates, so you move from this flesh, which is the outermost border of your spirit, which is the innermost, and you slowly penetrate in towards the spirit. In Yantra and Mandala, you do it by looking at it and getting your mind to go away from the external world and go into the internal world. Through Kundalini Yoga, it is by accessing the root chakra, the physical most part of your consciousness, and moving into the more ethereal parts of your consciousness. So I thought it was just interesting to talk about this, and for more videos, hit the subscribe button and like this video as well. That's it from me. Thank you. Bye-bye.